Well, good evening. Here we are again, and this is time for well, they call the show the Unconventional Pastor, and that's what they call me. My name is Bob Graves, and it's good to be back here with you again. Just spent a delightful hour with Greg Bray. Come to really like him a great deal. He's a wonderful person. And I think that a lot of you out there watching his show, Inspiring Honesty, in which I'm uh, you know, a co-host, sub-host, or whatever, um, that you've gotten to know him and see him as just a wonderful person. And in fact, a lot of us at the New Covenant Group have been really enjoying him a lot. And he's part of our meetings that we deal with, and he's just a delightful person to work with. So I really appreciate him. Anyhow, so here we are now back for an hour where I wanted to continue talking to you tonight. And I'm thinking this is going to be the last theme I'm going to visit on this particular thing that I've been dealing with. Um, a number of weeks ago, I began talking to you about some of the conflicts that I had in being honest with what I was seeing in Christianity itself, in the traditional way that I was approaching it, and trying to share with you what it was that led me down a unconventional path. And I talked about some of those beliefs, and then after we did that, I began talking to you about emotions. And I wasn't talking to you about that necessarily because I was accusing Christianity of having a real false view of emotions. I don't think Christianity really possesses any specific view that one could call the Christian view of emotions. But I would say this, that I think that for me, I came to my fundamentalism being a person who was already emotionally damaged, emotionally hurting, and kind of caught up in those sorts of things. And I found that my Christian traditional faith stagnated me, kept me stuck, and was a part of what I would consider the lack of productivity in making any real, honest headway. By the way, I should point out to you here. I hope you like it. My Christmas tree back here, I had to put a fallen angel on it. I don't know. The only angel I had was something that was a little too big, and as I put it on there, and it like wants to, bend over, and so so I thought, well, that's great. I have my fallen angel tree, and every so often you'll see that it twinkles in different colors. Anyhow, so I got some decorations I'm going to be putting on it, and I don't have them all on yet. But hey, we're celebrating Christmas here at the place. Anyhow, there was another area that I began talking about last time that I really felt that my traditional faith was also obstructing my particular progress here. And by the way, I think I mentioned this a few times, this theme here, that I have noticed I don't really necessarily accuse traditional Christianity of destroying everybody, or of making everybody foolish, or of making everybody a dumb business person. But I did feel that I noticed that the way that traditional Christianity seemed to work for me and for many other people was that um, however wise they were, that's how wise they were. However foolish they were, that's how foolish they were. And I didn't really see much of this change in anybody. So that I really saw a lot of the things that my traditional Christianity was doing for me, and what I saw it doing for other people, was pretty much just what they were doing for themselves. I don't want to mention any specific names, but I did work with the books of a number of different companies. And I mentioned this before, how I saw that the lack of wisdom in certain companies in terms of the way that they made their financial decisions, if they prayed about it, they never learned. They never changed their kinds of decisions. They never did a different approach to the analysis. They just continued making the same sorts of mistakes, some of them even 20 years later. And it's like, you know, because they're so committed to this idea that part of the problem was this, that if they made a business decision and it didn't go well, they don't see that as a cause for reassessment. They see that as, well, God called us to do that. He wanted us to do that. It didn't work out well. He must have been trying to teach us something. And so therefore they don't see themselves as in need of maybe adjusting the way they make business decisions. It's almost as if they're not in business for the purposes of business, which, you know, I suppose if it's a hobby, that's okay. But when you have employees and you're responsible for providing them with a way of providing for themselves, it just strikes me as being something you need to be a little bit more responsible for. Anyhow, um, uh, taking a long time to basically try to reassert one thing that I've seen before, and that is that I found that the Christianity tends to leave us where it finds us, the traditional Christianity, and so that I didn't see it really as you know, accomplishing for me anything. Um, the viewer comment says, "Don't they ever stop to think about what it is God is trying to teach them?" Um, well, when they do, they think it's some sort of personal lesson that has nothing to do with business. Uh, and part of the reason they do that, I think, is because they believe that ultimately God won't let them fail. That's not part of the plan. So therefore, because they have God's help, we have time, space, and we can afford to take all these detours to teach me something that doesn't have anything to do with business. So I get the impression that was basically what it's all about. And yet I never see them really learning anything. I just see them contemplating things and then perhaps reconfirming the sorts of things they already believe to be true, or maybe something that they heard from some new teacher that might then be confirmed. Anyway, I just saw it as a lot of nonsense that was not making much progress. And even in myself, I came to see that, so that it was rather stagnant. But another thing that I found, and I wanted to talk about this, and this will be the last theme that we talk about. I grew up in a sense of having no idea who I am, what's me, you know, what's really going on. I mean, you know, I'm a guitar player. I've been playing the guitar since a very young age, and I finally come to realize that that's a part of who I am. I'm certainly you know, a musician. I'm a teacher. There's a number of things that I do, but who am I? You know, what are the truths that I accept about myself that are really valid? I didn't feel that I knew that, and I felt that my traditional Christianity had kept me from being able to really make any real progress there, because I was basically following a hood ornament, the way that my Christianity was working for me, and going nowhere except where the car was already headed. And there just was no lesson to learn in that, and nothing to figure out about myself, until finally I realized, you know, you can drive into that brick wall so many times, and you finally realize that somehow even my decision that that's what God wanted me to do is got to be somehow questioned. Anyhow, so after I was able to abandon this loyalty to a fundamentalist belief, even though I still remained a person very much who believes in God, believes in the love of God, believes in the various realities of Christianity as I understand it now. I found that who it is that I am was something that was such a puzzle for me, particularly having been a person who had been through what I would consider um, a great deal of psychological and emotional damage. I've mentioned this before, and I'm not looking for sympathy. I feel like I'm well beyond it now, so that it's not any longer an issue for me that I'm aware of. Anyhow, but I even had I had one sister who I thought put it well. When she articulated it, really resonated with me. She would say, you know, our parents, they didn't raise us, they lowered us, and she would say that often, and every time she said it, I just couldn't feel that was anything other than so accurate an assessment of what was going on. it was a lot of difficulty and damage in the things we were made to believe about ourselves, the high level of criticism and analysis, and even looking back at it, well, without rehearsing it all, it left us as people who truly doubted ourselves, didn't know who we were, didn't know what our strengths really were, didn't know what our capabilities or abilities really were, but we were living in this illusion of incompetence and inability and ineffectiveness that we each in different ways had to find our way out of. And I found that as I got into this fundamentalism, that the fundamentalism sort of took over where the inadequate parenting ended up. Where that dropped off, the fundamentalist faith just kind of took over, and many of and this is not true for all fundamentalists, but for me, the various features of God that kind of accomplished the same role as the destructive parenting that I'd gone through just seemed to take over in many ways. And so that I saw at least fundamentalism, the way that I was embracing it, was keeping me from ever discovering my true self in any sense. And so once I had escaped that, I started to really go through what I would call a radical rediscovery of myself. And I want to share with you a little bit about how that process worked for me. Did a lot of things. For one thing, one of the first things that I did that had a radical difference is I inherited a chair from my Uncle Dean. It was this beautiful lazy boy chair, and my Uncle Dean was one of the only relatives I had who during his life spoke to me very, very kindly. He acknowledged my dignity as a person. He taught me how to play chess, even when I was young. And that even though he was going through a lot of difficulties himself, he finally died as an alcoholic. He was the one relative that was able to make me feel that maybe there was some hope in being me. I had gone through a great deal of anxiety, depression, and difficulty in adjusting myself. Anyhow, basically, when I finally get to this point, I have this chair that I inherited from him, and I used to sit in this chair, and I had this exercise that I would do. I would go back to certain events in my childhood that were for me very painful, and I'd kind of relive them, but in my mind's eye. But what I would do is this time I'd pretend, as it were, that my adult self was there to watch it unfold. And then I would allow my younger self, the 5-year-old or the 6-year-old Bobby, I imagine he would wander his way out to this particular tree that I knew about, and he'd sit under the tree. And then the adult me would come along, and I'd sit next to little Bobby, and I'd let Bobby talk to me about what's going on. And as he would talk to me, I would try to talk to him back and help him come to different conclusions so that he didn't end up saying to himself what he thought was true about himself the way he did. I also tried to help little Bobby in that conversation perceive his parents differently, and not angrily, but rather to recognize, look, they're going through their own issues. If they knew what they were doing, they probably wouldn't do this. Let's be honest about the fact that you don't have to be a monster to not know what you're doing and to actually be doing harm and damage. And I try to approach it from as fair-minded, taking care to respect everybody who was involved, but in a way that allowed me to put the entire experience in an entirely different context, and where I drew from it entirely different conclusions about what it says about me. And the odd thing is this: I found myself over time in doing this feeling very different about me and not being at all uncomfortable about some of these issues and incidents that used to make me feel very uncomfortable. There was a sense in which there was a time I think I was almost terribly embarrassed just to be me. And a sad thing for any human being to actually believe that the things they had been told or the things that had happened to them actually validly tell them that it's embarrassing for you to actually exist, you know. But you know, that helped me to overcome it. But as I did that, it made me wonder, you know, what was going on. Now during that time, I think I mentioned this on a previous show, that I was seeing a particular fellow who was a philosophy professor. I was talking to him about some of this, and one day he said something to me that was very arresting. Uh, it it hit me very hard. The truth of it, the relevance of it. He said, "Look, I understand you've been very angry at your mom and dad, and it's true that you went through a great deal of these issues and incidents that, in many ways, led to a great deal of damage. But let's let's be honest. None of that stuff ever really damaged you permanently, or even semi-permanently, until you believed what you thought it said about you. There's a sense in which until you believed it was valid, it couldn't hurt you. And the only reason why it's hurting you today is because you still think of it as valid. And the odd thing about it is this: you are letting the young Bobby, who lacked the critical thinking skills you have as an adult, who had no concept of what's going on in the adult world, you let little Bobby make the conclusions about what this says about you, and you've been holding on to those conclusions all these years. Don't you think the adult you would see it differently? And why don't you let that adult you go do that? And this is part of what provoked me to actually spend this time. I helped, you know, little Bobby see things differently than the way he did, which, of course, I'm saying, led me to eventually decide that I needed to kind of go through a personally led rehabilitation of myself, you know, and I didn't even have to go to the Group W bench. How about that? Um, anyhow, um, I began to say, well, wait a minute. Okay, if this is true, and it struck me as true, that it is what I thought these things said about me that really shaped my self-concept, not necessarily what happened. What happened was the occasion upon which these beliefs were embraced, but it was the actual believing of what these things said about me that gave me this sense of self. And so I had to ask myself, and I'll tell you, I went way back to the beginning, and I had to think it through. And I did a lot of studying of different things and tried to look at various psychology theories and personality development. And I said, I'm going to try to figure out who I am and how I got here, and who I should think of myself as. Now, I didn't find all the answers, but I also found I don't need all the answers. But here's a little bit of what I came up with. I find this fascinating. I don't know if you will, but I hope you find it helpful. The first thing I realized was that, you know, the brain is just an amazing organ in the way that it helps us as human beings deal with and the challenges of living in life. And I suppose that, you know, from what I'd studied, that I could see that when a little baby comes into the world, their sensory perception is, you know, they got all these senses. They can see, they can smell, they can taste, they can touch. But from what we understand about the way the neurology works, their brain is just receiving a random, chaotic amount of information that is meaningless. Doesn't mean anything. We know, for example, based on the way people respond to brain damage, that when the eyes see things, of course, you know, the lens of the eye allows something to come in through the eye, and it gets refocused on the back of the eye. And the way that the nervous, the neurology of the back of the eye works, that these stimulate various things back there that then send a neurological signal back to the back of the brain. And then from the back of the brain interprets this as a visual experience. But something that a lot of people don't realize is this: all of that information comes to the brain in a manner that is extremely chaotic. And it's only over time that the brain discovers that a stimulation that they see here and a stimulation that they see here possess this spatial relationship with each other. And it's as the experiences come in, the brain has to map out just where in the visual field this experience is supposed to be placed. And this happens very quickly, particularly with a young child, so that very quickly the child learns to focus on things. But probably originally, everything that comes to their eyes is just a chaotic blur of all sorts of stimulation that now has to be organized into a visual field, and the brain does this. And part of the reason why the brain does this is because if there's any brain damage, um, you're not going to like lose all my vision from this side over, unless that can't happen when there's optical nerve damage, because the optical nerve does divide itself out. But the brain can relearn. This happens sometimes when some people are in a car accident, for example, and they get some brain damage and they lose the ability to walk. And they relearn. They can relearn how to walk. And when first they walk, it's very unsteady, and they can't hold their balance. And it's like they just can't do it, as if they never knew how. But it wasn't a matter of knowledge. It was a matter of neurological connections that were made. And what happens is, as they go through the process of the rehabilitation therapy, different brain cells than the ones that were damaged begin to pay attention to what needs to be done and what muscles need to be reacting. And they're learning the process, and eventually they catch on and they deal with it. And with enough of this kind of practice, many people are able to one day walk just as well as they ever did. And the reason is because new brain cells learned how to organize all the chaotic information that's coming to it, so they can then start to exploit this information in a way that works. Anyway, what does that all have to do? The point was that I discovered that our experience of reality is actually buffered by a chaotic process. Now, that may not make any difference to you, but to me it was huge, and this for this reason. It told me that perception isn't reality. That reality is organized by me in my perception, and that I actually experience my perception, not my reality. That gave me the ability to let go of the reality that made so much sense to me, to say, well, wait a minute, this is something I organized, and maybe I didn't do such a great job of it. Maybe I can reorganize it. So as strange as it may seem, that's the way my weird brain was working when I thought about these things. And then I realized this as I'm looking at it, and looking at young children and the way that they learn and what they're going through. I began to discover that the human brain begins to learn about everything and anything, including who we are, first of all, by making general observations. It's the first ability that we ever really have in terms of trying to make sense of the world that we're in. We see these things. We become aware of the fact that they are things, that they exist. We become aware of the fact that we exist. We become aware of the fact that there's someone called mommy or daddy or whatever, that there's other people, that there are things, there are toys, there are rugs, there are houses, there are, all the things that we begin to experience. We begin to organize these things into part of our reality, and we do this by simply, first of all, becoming aware of them. But then we discover that things don't last forever, or that they go through changes. And we observe things going through changes. And that this, I'm going to make a long story short, that I discovered that the three major ways that we as human beings, as young human beings, come to understand what things are is mostly general observations of things that stood out to us for whatever reasons, perceiving these things as they go through changes, or as things change around them and they either change with them or don't change, so they remain consistent. And also, we develop relationships with people who, for some reason, become for us models of how to deal with things. And when we watch them deal with something, we learn from them what that something must mean to them, and therefore what it might mean to us. And so these things become for us the primary ways of learning anything: general observation, watching things in the processes of change, and relating to things in terms of what they seem to mean to other people. Now, there are many ways that we develop as adults to make sense of things that we do, that we understand them. We develop many critical thinking skills. But for most human beings, for all human beings, these are the three primary initial ways, and they will always be the three most credible ways that any of us learn anything. Whether or not they really possess that credibility doesn't matter. We experience them as credible. That's why they say seeing is believing. You observe something, now you believe it because you've seen it, as it were. If something goes through a particular set of change, you observe this, you make conclusions as to how it must work, and that seems extremely credible to you, even if somebody was playing games of smoke and mirrors. This is why magic can be so entertaining, because it appears to be that things are happening and changing in various ways when they're really not. And of course, we learn as adults to enjoy the sophistication of the illusion. But but also we're very significantly affected by the people around us and the things that they think. Make a long story short, what I finally came to the conclusion is this: who I think I am was actually based upon memorable moments that I had in my life wherein I made certain observations that for me became metaphors. The fact that I went through this experience tells me something about myself. Um, I remember one time, and I'm not going to get into too many details, that I was behind somebody's house that I had been playing with him, and I was going to cut through his backyard to get back down to my house after we were done, and I came across two boys who were kind of like the neighborhood bullies, and they started, punching me in the face, knocking me down, kicking me. They took some dog crap, stuffed it in my shoes, and then pushed my shoes back on me. There was a neighbor in the backyard of the house next to me, and I asked him if he could help me. He just stood there, and he did nothing. And I finally get home after being, going through all this abuse. I was probably 8 or 9 at the time, I think. And I wasn't a fighter. I didn't have any ability to fight. Didn't dare fight because the people I would have wanted to fight were probably much better at it than I was at that time. Anyhow, so I go home and I talk to my mom and dad about what happened to me. They were just totally unimpressed. They didn't, they're not interested in getting involved in the neighborhood drama or calling anybody's parents. And pretty much all my father had to say was, well, I don't know what you did to provoke them, but you need to stop doing that. And I became easily the guy who was easy to pick on in elementary school because, there was just no advocate I could count on, and I did behave in a way that perhaps no doubt did invite people to pick on me because I was an easy target and such a nice, wonderful button to watch when you push the buttons. But the point is that when I go through this thing and I observe things about myself, I see myself going through this difficulty. I see the neighbor ignoring me when I cry out for help. I see my parents feeling like this doesn't make any, never mind. This is part of where I make this observation that I don't matter, that I don't count, that my feelings are not of any value to anybody. And there's a number of other things that I concluded about myself that made sense to me during that event. And I believed those things as a little boy that, and I became very diminutive, very self-effacing, very, and things. But later as an adult, and as I go back and look at that event, I can see these guys who were beating me up as being, kids who probably had no real appreciation for just what they were doing. I'm not excusing them, but I'm certainly not going to try and demonize them. As from Mr. Wilson, who was this neighbor that was next door, when I called out to him, why he didn't respond, I have no idea. He may have had other reasons. Maybe he saw something that reminded him something from his childhood, and he was immobilized, or maybe he was kind of enjoying it. I have no idea, But the truth is, I have no idea. And I can't conclude what that says about me because I don't know what the facts are. And so that helped me to really kind of relook at this. So basically what I'm talking about is I went back through this event where that was one of my general observations, you might say. And that had caused me to draw conclusions about what that must mean about me. And I was able to then go back to these in several incidents, by the way, not just that one, and really draw different conclusions from the general observations that I would make. I also found that I would have to go back and make different conclusions about myself based on some of the changes that I went through, be it, puberty, becoming a guitar player, uh, discovering certain things about my past or my family, that when I saw these things that were for me changes, when we moved from one house to another, we moved when I was 6 years old. We moved a few days before my birthday, actually, before my sixth birthday. And one of the things that was strange is, as we're growing up, sometimes they celebrated my birthday, sometimes they didn't. And I remember by the time I was 18, I didn't really know what day my birthday was. We just didn't pay attention to it. And my dad never celebrated his birthday, ever, that I can recall. I think my mom on occasion did have a cake or something, but he didn't seem to have any interest in celebrating birthdays at all that I can recall. He didn't have any objection to them. They just were irrelevant to him. It didn't make sense. He even would have arguments with people who tried to make something special out of his birthday later when he was a widower. He just didn't want nothing to do with that. It's another day for him. He's just a day older. It was nothing in particular. He didn't have any philosophical objections to them. They weren't important to him. But anyway, in looking at this, my father was a person who, although he wasn't cruel in the sense of he was not angry all the time. He was not violent. He didn't strike me. My father, in many ways, was a person who would he would occasionally take the time to talk to me, but rarely. And when he did, he was offering me a critical analysis of what he understood to be what was going on and how things worked and why the things I was doing were young, immature, foolish, and unworkable. And basically, he was explaining to me the way I took it, how stupid and ridiculous I am in the way that I think, in the way that I put things together, in the way that I expect things to work, and that I'm just an incompetent idiot. Although he didn't use those words, he would point out all those incompetencies. He would point out all these errors. Look back at it, I think that he actually was under the illusion that these would help me. But they certainly didn't. The point being is that I discovered that it was through these memories that I had of certain moments where I made certain moments that were for me like aha moments, where I saw something that said, that tells me something about myself. I think back to some of these memories that I had where certain things were changing around me, and where the way things changed and how that worked for me told me something about myself. And then I found that, the various people that I knew who played a significant role in my life, they, in a sense, told me who I was. And I finally came to the point where I realized I've been listening to a lot of lies. I've been listening to the lies that were embraced by a younger, less critical, less thoughtful, less empathetic me. And I found that what I ended up doing is, in many ways, just reconstructing a sense of, well, hey, wait a minute. I would go back through these memories, reconstruct a different observation that was for me valid and authentic. I didn't just make up ideas to say, well, it'd be nicer to think about myself this way. Let's pretend I did this. Let's pretend I was the hero of the football game. I'm not talking about doing it. Let's look back at the actual events that I lived through that stood out to me as significant, maybe even painful. And let's see if there might be better, more honest, more thoughtful, more empathetic, more loving conclusions that I could validly draw from what these things say about me. And here's the thing, that the more that I did that, the more I discovered that those events from the past just didn't have any effect on me the way that they used to. And that I came to see myself in a way that was so radically different that I literally emerged as a totally different person, taking responsibility for the fact that what I thought about myself, what I embraced to be so, what made sense to me from the observations I made of my own life, from the way that I felt I was dealing with changes, the way I was dealing with the people around me, that I wasn't really helping myself out with this, and that I could help myself out a little differently. And so I did. It left me a completely different person. I emerged as a person who was far more peaceful, far more easygoing. I liked myself. I liked other people. I found that that I wasn't alone, of course, that I wasn't the only person who'd ever had a bad time and thought ill of themselves. I found myself in a room, or in a world, I should say, that was filled with people who had been easily seduced into believing terrible things about themselves that just aren't true, things that devalue them, things that make them feel worthless. And I found myself wanting to help people to see themselves very differently. And it even altered the way that I thought God must see me, the patience, the hope, the belief that He has in me. His I'll tell you, I'd always thought that God seemed to be rather silent, and at first it felt to me like abandonment. And after a while, I got to tell you that when my faith went through these changes, as I came to a new emerging sense of myself, the silence of God came to me to mean His great confidence. You know, um, there's nothing to say. You're doing fine. This will work. You'll get there. Work it through. What you can figure out will be great. What you can't isn't really going to matter all that much. And this isn't the end of it all. Not to say that things aren't worth anything, but we're just not worried about it in terms of where it's all going to go. And when I was working through things differently, I was becoming such a different person that there's some people who know me today who knew me back when I was a fundamentalist, and some of them can't get over they can't put the two people together. Um, and these are all these radical changes that I was able to go through as a result of letting go of that fundamentalist faith. I've since come to a point where I realize that all of us actually have a sense of who it is we think we are that is based upon a story we invented, that is lodged in the memories of certain events we went through that tell us who it is we think we are, and that those events in our lives involved certain events where we made basic general observations, where we observed ourselves as things were going through change, and where we took the credibility of the way other people modeled things or said things or related to things that are related to us as having some validity in saying something about us. When I began taking responsibility and control of just what those conclusions were and rethinking them, just amazing, all those changes that happened. And I'd have to say that my faith has also changed toward a God who wants to encourage us to take responsibility, to be ourselves, to celebrate being ourselves, to allow other people to celebrate who they are, to allow other people to discover for themselves who they are, to lead and guide people to make proper observations. I think that an example of the way that this can work was something I saw in the news recently when somebody was quoting Fred Rogers, the old PBS guy who's no longer with us, where Fred Rogers said when there was some sort of a national incident that is going on, that one of his parents, maybe both of them, pointed out to him when he's watching the news on TV about some of these horrible things that are happening. They point out, look at all the helping people. Look at the people who are helping. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that wonderful? And it helped him to focus on not the horror of the event, but the amazement of in this event how people are coming out and in empathy, reaching out to the people who hurt, and to actually look at that and to celebrate that. Now, that focus is just as valid as is the focus in terms of what's really happening of the horrific events that we might be looking at. But I'll tell you, there is something for us to be wise about in recognizing the horror that can happen, but also in investing in the good that people can do. We don't want to so jade ourselves that we observe one thing but not the other. We need to be, wise as serpents and harmless as doves, as it were. We need to be aware of the fact that we live in a world where horrible, awful things can happen, but we need to wonder at and find awe in the amazing human spirit when it is healthy, when it is loving, the kinds of things that it can do. And I found that I was living in a faith where this was the sort of thing that I felt was more at the core of the heart of God. In fact, this has more to do with loving. It's to me the absurdity of it. I used to have a faith that was focused on doctrine. Do you believe this or do you believe that? Is Genesis literal or is it figurative? Is is the atonement something which is vicarious? Is it substitutionary? Is it penal? Is it what possible relevance do any of those questions have to do with the real meaning of life? I don't see it. But are you lovely? Are you worthwhile? Is your experience a valid one? Is how you think about yourself important? Then I care about that. And I hope you do too. And I hope that how you care about how other people think about these things, I hope that's also important and valuable. And whether or not we love others as ourselves and love God and we're focused on these things that help us to relate to the preciousness that we are and that other people are, even the preciousness of our enemies. And I'll tell you this, I certainly even got to the point where, although I believe that the way my parents went about raising their children, I don't know why they had 7 kids. It doesn't make sense to me. But, in terms of what it was for their generation, where they personally were, I think my father possibly had some Asperger's. I don't know what the explanation is, but I believe in humanity now enough to know that something must have damaged them somewhere, even in ways they didn't realize or recognize or think of as damage or even know how to deal with. Or maybe it's something they felt so much shame about they never revealed it to me. I don't know. I don't need to know. I don't care. But I'm not holding this against them anymore either. In fact, I actually went to my dad one day. When was this? I think it was like 1984, 85, somewhere around there. I went to my dad and I said, Dad, I really feel it's important that I share this with you. And I want you to know that I'm not claiming that my observations are accurate. I just want to share with you what my observations were. And I shared with him about how when I grew up, I never felt loved. I didn't feel that I was lovely or worth loving. And I certainly never felt that he loved me. And I told him, I said, look, I'm not saying you didn't. I'm just saying that was the kind of thing that was never communicated to me. I don't remember kissing you, sitting on your lap, holding your hand, having a powerful conversation with you. I don't remember you ever saying anything to me nice. One of the things I said is that, like, I used to run track because you were a runner, and I thought I was going to impress you. And I won every mile race I was ever in. And you didn't come out to any of these meets. And he says, well, I was there for 2. And I said, well, I didn't see you there. Well, I was there. And I said, but you never said anything like, hey, good job, Bob, or this is the way to go, or you can get him. I said, you never had any words of encouragement or praise from me. And why is that? He said, well, when I was a child, we had an indoor track at the school where I went to. We trained all year round. And frankly, when you're up here in this area, we don't have year-round tracks. The running is unimpressive. And I'm thinking, well, then why can't it be impressive that I did as well as I did without all of the assets that you had, And he was a mile runner. Anyway, finally, when I was a kid, I finally came in where I wouldn't do that. But anyway, so in this conversation I'm having with him, and I told him, I said, you were always very critical, and I don't think you realize how inappropriate that was. And his response to that was, well, evidently I wasn't critical enough. Look at how it is you've turned out. And he meant that with all of his heart. And he wasn't trying to be mean. It wasn't his way of saying, well, oh yeah, well, I'll tell you what, evidently, you ass, I was not critical enough because look, he was saying it as a matter of fact. And when he said that, I realized something. This man is not my father. He's just some guy I know. And I made a decision that day that I would never look to him again to be my father. But I was not going to cut him off either. I was going to get to know him as best I could as some guy. And I got to tell you, my relationship with my dad was very good from that day forward. Now, he went through a period of anger there that I would have the audacity to tell him such a thing. And, it took him 2 weeks or so before he could get out of that anger. And it wasn't until after my mother passed away that he could feel very comfortable talking to me, and he talked my head off then. But, I went to football games with him. He never became to me the kind of a person I needed as a dad, but I didn't look to him for that either. And I found him to be in many ways a very interesting, charming, intelligent, a delightful person, very charming. He just didn't have that relational connection I needed in a dad. I wasn't looking for it. And so I actually say I came to the point where this doesn't hurt me anymore. It really doesn't. In fact, the things that I've learned about myself, although I wouldn't recommend going through that kind of a trip to get there, I'm glad I know them now. I'm glad I realize how important they are. I hope that based on what I've gone through, that would even help me to be a person who's even more effective in reaching out to others, in helping them to understand just how wonderful and how precious it is for them to be them, how much people really need to believe in themselves, how each of us are in and I'm not talking about, ridiculous positive thinking, and I'm not talking about not taking responsibility for our attitudes, our motives, our choices, and things like this. I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about, in our essence, recognizing how powerfully precious it is for us to exist, and that who we are as human beings is something far more valuable than any of us have the ability to even put together, and that we need to start relating to people as people, worthy of love, dealing with the issues and problems that we have with each other in a manner that seeks to rebuild upon that value rather than bothered about the ways that damage has been done to us through that. We've got other viewer comments here, and I've been kind of ignoring them. Viewer comment, I can see how kind and patient you've become, Bob. Perhaps God will spare you from the coming apocalypse. I certainly hope so. And there's a smiley face there. Anyway, great message, Bob. Sharing personal experiences reminds us all that we're human. So thanks. Well, I hope that is helpful to you. And by the way, this is one of the reasons also why I'd have to say that my faith had to head down a non-traditional path. I found that traditional faith was something that was more about sustaining and retaining the structure of the tradition and the power structure of the people who run that tradition. and it had very little to do with the real value of people, particularly in the area where it's been a long-standing, at least Protestant concept, in this what they call the priesthood of the believer, that we have direct access to God, that we don't go through a priest and all this. And yet look at all the flack that we go through. We let all of the observations other people point out define us. We let all of the changes we go through say something about us based on the way other people explain what's supposed to be. And we let all of the people have this power in our lives to relate to us in a way that tells us something about ourselves. I don't think this is working so well for all of us. And I found that, in a sense, my faith in God was more rooted in, what does he observe about me? What has he noticed about me? What does he think of it? I don't know, but I could imagine based on the kind of a God he must be. And I found that by trying to think about it in those ways, where I'd get objective and outside myself and look at the preciousness of being, that would work for me better. What does God understand the changes I'm going through? And does he see it in the same way that I do? Is he an influential opinion in my life and things like this? And what must his opinion be? I finally got to the point in my life where I was autonomous enough that when I talk to people who don't like me, it doesn't bother me that much. They don't like me. I wonder what it is that, they don't have to, first of all, but I wonder what it is that that makes that creates this wall between us. I wonder what it is, but I certainly didn't take it personally. When I find myself going through times that are difficult or where things aren't working out well, I don't take it personally. I look at it, and not everything's going to work out well. Not everything can do that. And sometimes there might be something to learn from it, that I can figure out how to do things. Maybe I can talk to somebody else who can help me learn how to understand things better, and just learn from the experience instead of let it say something about me. I can be a learning person. That can be a part of it. But the biggest thing that I also think it had for me, and I got to wrap up now, is this, that it helped me to define myself as the person I am becoming, not the person I concluded I must be based on the past. The past is, every day of my past was assessed by a person nowhere near as mature as I am today. And I'm headed toward a future that's going to be lived in by a person who's going to be far more mature than I am today. So my identity is more based on who it is I'm discovering myself to be as I'm headed toward that future of becoming that. And I'm delighted with the mystery. Anyhow, that's a lot about how I ended up in this unconventional path. I hope it was meaningful and useful to you, and we'll see you again. Take care. This is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick around. In just a moment, Dr. Jones and Bob Greaves are going to be speaking with Alan Darley. It should be a fantastic discussion. Alan is coming from a little more of a different point of view than our two co-hosts, and it will be a conversation to remember. So don't miss it. It's coming up at 8 o'clock Central Standard Time.